is essentially saying that this has been mostly about land management of urbanizable land and development control. And then the Jakarta presentation talked about region as an ecological region, right? And there's something that could be constructed by civil society formations that could scale up all the way to the region. So very interesting perspectives, not necessarily probably representing everything that, I mean, there's no reason to essentialize these things, as the Americans are all about money and the British are all about people.
It'd be nice if it was true, but it probably isn't.
So, that's wonderful, great.
So one of the things is the British automatically react against the Americans.
Yeah.
So if the Americans go on like that, we want to react.
But there may also be something, you know, I mean, London is such an ancient city that it existed a long time before anybody worked out what it was for, whereas American cities, in a sense, are younger, and cities in developing countries can be anything they want to be, in a way, which London can't be, because it's already London.
So, welcome to India and the conference, and thank you for joining us in this conversation. I and my colleague Anant Maringanti, who is also the editor of the Urban Affairs Review, Economic and Political Weekly here, which is India's premier social science journal. Sue, you were, as we were starting this conversation, you spoke about this whole issue of London being already there. So, in what sense do you think the historical specificity of that particular place makes a difference to the way it's actually governed? Because I understand that other cities in England are governed quite differently. And yet, there is both, from your presentation yesterday, a lot of toing and froing about how London should be governed. Whereas perhaps other cities don't evoke as much passion or as much interest in how exactly their arrangements are, seem to work around their arrangements in a particular fashion. So, in what sense do you see the historical nature of what London has come to be instrumental in the manner in which it is governed today, or does it not really matter?
There was an interesting conversation yesterday about capital cities versus other megacities, and I think London being the capital city makes it very different to every other city in the UK, and London is hugely the dominant economic force in the UK, and so both of those factors are also important. I think for the people of London, its history is important. It has a lot of history and culture and sense of itself and sense of place, which is true of most cities, but is particularly strong, I think, because it's the seat of government and the capital and the centre of the economy. So all of those things make London quite different from the other British cities. And, of course, it's just dominant in size. You know, there's nothing else in the UK that's remotely close. Nothing else in Europe, actually. And so London is quite a unique place in the UK and in Europe. And for that reason, I guess, at the times when London government is poor, when it has been chaotic and when there hasn't been very much coherence, the experience of the capital city not working very well, you know, is pretty powerful and visceral, and the public, the media, the politicians, you know, begin to be exercised about the fact that the capital city doesn't seem to be able to clean its streets, or the capital city doesn't seem to be able to get the buses to run. And so solving those problems has become politically important.
And maybe just to add to that, I mean, it's hard perhaps to imagine from outside of the UK just how London dominated a lot of the cultural institutions are in Britain as well, and the class system in many ways. And people like Doreen Massey and other geographers argue that London is just too centred, that in fact British life is centred around London. It's not just about the economy, but it's also about Wimbledon, it's about the Lord's Test match, it's about a whole series of social and cultural factors that make it such a powerful centre. And of course the media are there. Yes, and what Sue is saying is absolutely right, in that what happens in London seems to be characterised as a national set of issues as well as a local set of issues. And then on top of that, you've got an extraordinary situation where the scale of London makes its governance a quantitatively and qualitatively very different thing. So in some of the London boroughs, for example, the borough that I live in, you'll find it has a population just within the local authority area within London of about 300,000. I mean, that's double the population of a big town like Reading, just in one borough, in one of the 32 boroughs in London. And so you've got this extraordinary set of governance dynamics around a huge number of people in a particularly small area, which does make it different in many ways. And what happens is that then historically, those boroughs came together in 1965, and so there's a lot of different identities. There are a lot of local sub-metropolitan identities, particularly within the outer parts of London, but also actually within central London as well, which also add to its kind of historical, long-term governance trends, in terms of the way in which a city works. So you have very different political cultures in different places. You have, where I live, for example, people being obsessed with their postcodes or their phone numbers not being a London number, as though somehow that's some kind of form of identity. In fact, actually, often quite, being quite anti-central London, where I live, feeling as though it's a different city to where I live, which is out in the suburban areas. So you've got all these kind of dynamics kind of going on and playing off against each other at the same time. And the final point to make is that London's centrality is also quantitative. So it's not just about cultural things. Public spending in London is higher than in any other English region, by some margin as well. You have the centre of government, you have huge government projects, you have London as the centre of big infrastructure investments. It has a whole series of centralities to what goes on within the UK national space, the English national space in particular, actually, within the British context.
Yeah, well, I'd like to reinforce what Mike says about the scale, the fact that it is 8 million compared with any other city in Britain that's on a different scale. And that, as Mike says, it introduces the whole issue of the relationship between the government of the local level to a strategic level, because that immediately, because of the scale, it becomes an issue, the integration of the two levels. The other thing to say in terms of involvement of the other cities, in the 1990s, which is when globalization first sort of started to impinge on government thinking, they produced this program called City Pride. The idea was for cities to project themselves in this globalized world in order to win in this competitive environment. And cities were invited to put together sort of vision packages in order to do this. And London Pride became a sort of important vision that preceded the GLA. But Manchester and Birmingham were also involved in that. So the three cities were all involved in that programme. Although London obviously is the more important one, as that is the biggest driver of any competitive thrust that the government might want to have.
I mean, Manchester is interesting because Manchester is the other big success story in the UK. And Manchester and its surrounding local authorities, there's 12 of them, have worked collaboratively, and they've worked collaboratively for about 20 years, and have managed to create a city region voluntarily, without statute, without any sort of legal backing. They have just worked collectively as a group of local authorities and created quite an effective city region which is growing and which is successful, and they own the airport collectively, and they're now making a bid for another airport in the UK. So there is a different there are two models in a sense of successful city regions in the UK, and I think Manchester is the other one, and it works very differently.
It's actually very interesting that you brought up Manchester, and I think it matters in terms of history in other ways too, right? Manchester was the industrial area, and during the period of globalization, Manchester must have declined industrially and in terms of manufacturing, and that must have done a lot of difference to the relationship between Manchester and London within the national economy. How did that play out in the way in which these two different models came up? And the story that you're telling is about how Manchester came together in the last 20 years. Must have been something to struggle against the decline of the industrial resources of that region, whereas London was capitalizing on the symbolic capital that it had historically accumulated through its empire building. Whole variety of symbols that you mentioned about the Wimbledon, about the Lords, all of those.
Well, I think one of the triggers to Manchester's transformation in that sense was when they bid for the Olympic Games. Because they bid for the Olympic Games, and one of the purposes of that was to change the image of Manchester as not being an industrial city, but being something else. They didn't get the Olympic Games, and there was probably no likelihood that they would, but it was a way of presenting to the world that Manchester is now different. But one thing that did come out of that was that they got the Commonwealth Games. And the Commonwealth Games was a highly successful event, and they built upon that to demonstrate that they were now able to manage their city and transform their city into a new kinds of sectors, and built upon that to develop all sorts of other programs since then, which has snowballed. But that was the initial,
in my view,
of that transformation.
Yeah, but I'm not sure Manchester is a success story, actually, I have to be honest. Yes, I think in terms of some of the governance dynamics, it looks like a success story. It's very good at place marketing. It has a number of entrepreneurial activities that go on. There's a new conference centre and all this kind of thing. But the city is still down league tables in terms of its socio-economic characteristics. It has some areas of unbelievably concentrated poverty and so on, even in those regeneration areas to the east of Manchester. And it has a lot of problems structurally in terms of its economy. It's not just about deindustrialisation, it's also about a lack of new jobs coming in to fill those. And in fact, places like Salford, where I've done quite a lot of research in the Greater Manchester area, is an area of remarkable polarisation. So new media, there's been an attempt to decentre the BBC within the UK context. So the BBC have moved a lot of their facilities out of London as part of an attempt to help regenerate other parts of England. Moved to Manchester, moved to Salford, and yet the polarisation in that particular part of Manchester is now actually extraordinary. I did a lot of research with young people and so on living there, for whom these things don't offer any hope. In fact, they're actually seen as a symbol of what they don't have, in a way, which is actually quite an interesting kind of politics. But also, the other point is that Manchester and the north of England, in general, the big cities in the north of England, help feed the London economy by providing high-skilled workers. And so you have this incredible churn of workers coming from the universities, in particular in the northern cities, training up good graduates. But where do graduates go? They come south. That's where the better jobs are seen to be, anyway, and often are. So you have this very interesting relationship between London and the regions. So it's not. It's more of a kind of, there are kind of more backwash effects going back into London than spread effects, some people would argue, in terms of how the economy works.
It's quite interesting.
It's a huge argument about whether it's a parasitic city or whether it's a propulsive city.
And it crystallises around the new proposal for the high speed rail between Manchester and London, which is a highly controversial proposal that the government is going ahead with at the moment. And this debate about some people think that will help Manchester and the northern regions because it will mean that the travel distance to London is shorter. And others saying no, it's going to work the other way. It's going to actually benefit London and actually drain the regions. And so there's a big debate about that at the moment.
Two other senses in which the history and geography might matter, and I'd like to hear what you think about it. One of the things that you mentioned yesterday is and you're also reinforcing that today, about the enormous amount of sub-metropolitan diversity. A lot of it comes from a colonial legacy, people coming from post-colony regions across the world. How does this matter to the structures of governance? Do they matter at all? Do not figure at all in the way in which this governance is planned? Because many of the new migrants would probably be moving into niche economies, right? They would be looking for opportunity expertise in particular kind of economic spaces. How does it matter to the electoral politics? How does it matter to the institutional design? Does it even figure at all?
Well, I think it matters a lot. I mean, one of the things that we were saying yesterday, I think, was that placemaking is becoming really important to London because of a lot of immigration, a lot of churn. Increasingly, of course, the immigration is coming from Northern Europe rather than, you know, the old sort of Commonwealth countries, and that's making a difference. But actually, people are coming from all sorts of countries. You know, the diversity of migrant workers is greater than it's ever been. So there's I mean, one issue that I thought was interesting yesterday was the discussion about informality and the informal economy. And what's interesting, in a sense, is that although we have got relatively sophisticated democratic structures in London, and we were talking about the two levels, about the boroughs and the GLA. In the boroughs, some of them are quite effective at trying to connect with diversity and connect with different communities, and there has been some success, I think, in terms of building relatively weak social capital between different communities and creating quite a comfortable sense of place. It's interesting that in some of the boroughs with some of the biggest greatest diversity of population, they're still getting survey results which say something like 80-85% of the population will answer yes to the question, this is an easy place to live and I get on well with my neighbours and I feel that people are comfortable living alongside each other. So there's some evidence of that being relatively comfortable. But I think the most recent migrant populations tend to be outside of most of those democratic conventions. They don't have the same contacts, they don't have the same access, so it takes time for new communities to move into the democratic process, and it takes time for them to feel that they have a voice and a representation. So the established communities, the Indian Pakistani communities, the Afro-Caribbean communities, increasingly the West African communities are beginning to feel part of the democratic process, and they're not as well represented democratically as they should be, but there are councillors and people involved. But the very newest populations tend to be outside of that process, and hopefully, if London carries on doing what London has done for centuries, there's a sort of wave effect, and eventually communities move into the democratic process and begin to feel part of it. And it's a matter of timing rather than anything else, that it takes time for that absorption to happen. But in the meantime, there are obviously also tensions. And of course, there's a conventional, old-fashioned white working class community, particularly in the poorest areas, feeling beleaguered and feeling a bit sort of ignored by everybody. And there is still a sort of racist vote with UKIP and the BNP and the small parties losing rather than gaining support in some of these areas. So there have been areas of London that have seen off a relatively strong BNP vote, which is now sort of reducing, partly because of immigration of new communities, and so that changes the voting patterns. Mm-hmm. But it's a perennial tension, I think.
And so, for example, if we're talking about integration.